I'd like to welcome all our viewers on the OMN English program. I'm joined here by the OMN's Executive Director, Mr. Jawar Mohammed. Jawar, I'm happy to have you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So there's a lot of developments going on right now in Ethiopia and particularly in the Oromia region as well. So we're going to start from the top. There was a market boycott that was announced by Cairo youth activists last week. And I'm going to start by asking you, what was the result of that boycott? Was it successful? Did it achieve its objective?
Yes, it was actually very successful, more successful than anybody had thought, because for the last 3-4 months, the protest has been stopped because people focused on resettling and helping people, those who were displaced from Somali region. Because of that, a lot of people thought that Cairo has disappeared or surrendered to the government, have given up. So when this boycott was called, there was a lot of skepticism. Also, as you know, the internet is not working in Ethiopia. Previous protests, previous strikes were coordinated through internet, and many people thought the internet would make it inefficient. However, the strike was very, very successful. It completely shut down the country. And it forced the regime to submit to the demands of the protesters, which was immediate and unconditional release of the political prisoners. The government had previously promised to release the prisoners about a month earlier, but it delayed releasing them and also continued to present different kind of excuses. For example, creating conditions that they have to sign pardon, they have to apologize to the government. In other cases, like in Bakala, they were saying, oh, you have violated the discipline in court, and they sentenced them to a year and additional prison time. So the protesters were able to force the regime to give up on all those conditions and excuses and immediately release them.
Okay. And following the market boycott and the release of the political prisoners, as you mentioned, the Prime Minister, Hailemariam Desalegn, immediately resigned. And that was also followed the next day by an announcement of state of emergency in the country. So these seem to be contradicting actions going on the part of the government. How do you explain that?
Indeed, it's a very contradicting action. The previous week, and the government was showing a lot of gestures that it was willing to liberalize the political space. They had released a lot of political prisoners, thousands of them. The Opidio Central Committee had, passed a resolution that looked like they are willing to open up the political space to competition, including inviting diaspora-based oppositions to come back and promising free and independent media in the country. Then the Prime Minister resigns and says his reason for resigning is to facilitate transition and inclusive politics and reconciliation and so on. But a day later, we hear that they were imposing a 6-month state of emergency. On one hand, you show a sign that you are going to open up the politics. On the other hand, you impose a draconian state of emergency that curbs all rights in Ethiopia. And I thought those were not only strange, also counterproductive for the government. Counterproductive because it tarnishes the hope of reform and the democratization. It's also counterproductive because the government really doesn't have the capacity to impose a state of emergency at this point. Why take this risk? There is really no justifiable reason for taking this risk. The protests have been very, very peaceful, highly disciplined. There is no threat to public order. The local police in Oromia were capable of handling the security situation, both in Amhara and Oromia. The police were quite successful in handling the situation. By declaring a state of emergency, the government is threatening to send more soldiers. But everywhere there is soldiers, there is death and instability. The state of emergency would only exacerbate the political crisis. It doesn't bring about a solution.
All right. A lot of critics would say that because with the state of emergency, the Constitution is suspended for the time being. A lot of critics would say the Constitution has never really been implemented as it should be. So what is the difference with this announcement?
Well, I think that Christian is right because Ethiopia has been under state of emergency since this government came to power. State of emergency entails, revoking certain rights, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and so on. These freedoms have never been respected in Ethiopia. Journalists have been languishing in jail for writing against the government or for airing their opinion. For example, in Oromia is under, it has always been under a state of emergency. You have, hundreds of thousands of people being sent to jail for just being Oromo. So a state of emergency have been there practically. The tenets of state of emergency, that is militarized control of the population, have been there for a long time, and more importantly, in the last 3 years, the military have been everywhere in Ethiopia, in Oromia, in Amhara region, killing people at will and imprisoning people. So the state of emergency doesn't really bring any new added measure. Last year there was state of emergency. That was a little different because they brought in heavy military and people. It had a psychological impact because there was no official state of emergency. When this new state of emergency came in October of 2016, it had a psychological impact to some extent. It scared people into stopping the protest. However, this time around, people have adapted to what state of emergency was. One of the laws of last year's state of emergency was cutting off the internet, but internet has been off for last 3 months in Ethiopia. So the state of emergency comes, internet, well, the same thing, the normal thing. So in Oromia, there's been 3, 4 days since the state of emergency has been declared. Life goes on. People protest. They gather at will. They stay up late night and they walk in the cities. It really did not make any difference. It just ridiculed the government. It made the government look like a joke.
Yeah. And there also seems to be a lot of miscommunications within the government. Earlier in the week, the communications minister, Nagari Lenjo, was on VOA, and he had stated that there would be no state of emergency announced in the country. And shortly after, just a day later, state of emergency was announced. So is there a lack of communication going on within the government, or is there a rift there, or can you explain that for us?
Nagari would tell you, if you ask him this question, Dr. Nagari would tell you that there is a crisis of communication, but I don't think it's just a crisis of communication. There is a crisis of leadership. There is a vacuum. Since Mallas's days, the prime minister that just departed never asserted control. He never brought discipline to the leadership. There has been multiple points of power. The military, the intelligence, the different ministries, particularly ministries that are filled by the Tigrayans, felt they are above the prime minister. They did not feel that they needed to report to the prime minister. And the prime minister himself admitted, I think last year, that he actually doesn't have any clue what's happening in the country. He doesn't get information. He makes his decision based on what he hears here and there. Let alone Nagari Lencho, the prime minister had no idea about what was happening. This has exacerbated with the Oromo protest because the protests have, hit the ship really hard, making people doubt the endurance of the government, making them lose hope in the government, and starting acting independently. And with the breakout of the conflict on Somali-Oromia border, the Oromo ministers and the Oromia regional government felt that the federal government is the enemy, and they felt that they don't need to really respect the federal government much, and the federal government acted in a very bizarre way, not only taking side but also refusing to interfere, refusing to help those displaced. So people like Nagari had evolved into some kind of opposition within the federal government. Because of that, the other agencies in the government, they don't trust them. When it comes to this latest episode of state of emergency, I believe when Nagari said that there is no need for a state of emergency and he doesn't know if there is any, because nobody informed him. This decision was not made by Minister of Councils as people claim. This was a decision made by what they call the National Security Council, which is pretty much did not have the power to do it, but did it anyway. So people like Nagari and other Oromos and Amharas were not included in this discussion. This was done by the intelligence and by the military. and brought to the media and announced it. If you heard, I don't know, there was a number of media outlets who were invited there, and they're told that there is no state of emergency to be declared tonight. And the minute they leave the hall, they announced it. So that looks like a military intervention rather than civilian government reaching a consensus and passing that kind of agreement.
Okay. Well, now that we have, opposition leaders such as Bakala Gabba or Bana Lelisa have been released, Aero activists are continuing to say that their struggle will continue until their demands are met. There's a rift growing in the government, as you mentioned. What's next for the country? I mean, what's next for the government, and where do the people go from here?
I think the government is on its last leg. I cannot see this government surviving any longer. There is when this protest started, probably about a year ago, there could have been four possible outcomes. One is the government regaining control and defeating the protesters and putting them back in their place and reasserting authoritarian rule. That it attempted so many times that has failed. The protesters continue to grow both in depth and width. So the possibility that of counter-revolution or reversal of the revolution is now going to happen. The second possible scenario is the protesters exert insufficient pressure on the government to force it to undertake measures that will facilitate transition to an open democratic process. That seemed to be still a possibility, but narrow impossibility. If you looked at what was happening in Oromia for about a year and a half, it was a promising situation. Lama Magarsa has liberalized the political space. He has allowed protest. He has ordered the police not to shoot people. He has engaged critical voices and elders, and what that has liberalized the space in Oromia to some extent in Amhara region. And if you have asked me about 6 months ago, I would have been very optimistic looking at some of the changes that are visible in Oromia. But the measures that we see today, as we said at the beginning of this conversation, is contradictory. On one hand, the release of political prisoners, a number of the measures the government undertook under the pressure of the protesters, gives you hope that the government is finally seeing the end and preparing for exit strategies through a democratic process. But at the same time, when you see some of the measures they take, for example, imposing a state of emergency, and also in the military promoting military generals that were implicated in displacement of millions of people and killing of hundreds of people, to full rank of generals and giving them key command, and refusing to diversify the military rank, and also refusing to diversify the intelligence, it tells you that TPLF is not prepared to willingly relinquish power. So right now, the window towards a negotiated transition between the ruling party and the opposition, the opportunity is kind of dwindling. It's getting desperate. It's becoming quite difficult to have a full picture of how that's going to happen. So there is slim chance still, but that chance is about to disappear, particularly if the government continues to fully enforce the state of emergency, if the parliament does not revoke the state of emergency declared by Minister of Council of Ministers, the possibility of democratic transition through negotiation might be closed. Then that will take us to a third option, which is the protesters continuing to gain momentum and overpowering the regime and bringing down the regime and leading to establishment of democratic order. The fourth is a revolutionary a disintegration of the state. If the protest do not focus, if the protest disintegrates into communal violence, and if the state also fails to reassert control, or if the state, as we see today, is crippled with infighting, and if the different factions within the government end up in open war, you could have a serious scenario that we see in different parts of the world. So I'm still optimistic about peaceful transition, because there are potentials. I mean, if they choose a capable prime minister and prime minister that can preside over a negotiation between the opposition and the ruling party. Somebody who has accepted that this regime is over and the country is moving to democratic order. Maintaining a dictatorship is no longer a viable option. If you bring somebody like that, somebody who has popular support, somebody who has popular legitimacy, somebody who has experience and patience to deal with a diverse country like Ethiopia, you still have slim chance. But if they choose another puppet, if they choose another person who doesn't see the possibility and the necessity of moving forward, then you will have a serious problem, and that will force the Kairos to move to option three, which is removal of the regime.
Yeah, you actually went to my next question and point, which was you mentioned that the government is actually being manipulated and controlled by the intelligence and the military officials. So, do you think that appointing the right person in the prime minister position would resolve that situation? What kind of freedom would that prime minister have, to solve all the problems in the country?
Appointing the right person by itself is now going to solve the problem. It's now going to force the military and the security to reform. However, today in Ethiopia, there is just not single powers. 3 years ago, 2 years ago, TPLF had a monopoly over the state. It had full control of the country. Today, there is a shared power in Ethiopia because half of the power has gone to Kairos. The Kairos control much of the power in Ethiopia today. A lot of the power the ability to control the country has shifted significantly toward the Kairos power, and the Kairos control much of Oromia, and the government cannot dictate the way it used to. So if you bring in a prime minister that can be supported by Kairos, by the larger Ethiopian population, if you bring a prime minister and a team of people, not just one person, a team of leaders forward who believe in the necessity and possibility of change. And if these people are fully supported by the emerging power of the Cairo and the various social movements in Ethiopia, that prime minister and his team would have a strong ally in the country that could help them offset the military and the intelligence. And because the military and the intelligence, at the end of the day, they want to intimidate people, but if they can't intimidate people, if anytime the prime minister and his team are threatened, they come out and speak, then the military and the intelligence are not going to be able to stage the kind of coup or other stuff. Remember what happened in Turkey, and when you have a president or an executive that is really, really popular, we have seen how people overpowered tanks. Erdogan, the military wanted to stage a coup against him, and all that guy had to do was appear through a cell phone on a TV. The coup was reversed. And in Ethiopia too, I mean, it might be too far-fetched to bring similar stuff, but if you have somebody who is popular, who can easily mobilize people among the ruling party to come to the forefront, it will not be easy for the military to manipulate, to intimidate, and get away with it. So that's why we need that kind of person. Not only that, bringing that kind of popular person, capable person who has earned public trust, also enables that person to gain concession from the opposition, concession from the ruling party, bring a whole lot of section of the society to come together and chart a roadmap and timetable towards democratic election. It's a slim possibility. I'm not saying this is the outcome that's going to happen, but it's a slim possibility. But if they choose another puppet, if they choose another Haile Mariam, if they choose another Mukhtar Kadir, that chance will be gone, and the military will not be able to control people. It will kill a lot of people, but change is inevitable one way or another.
Okay. And recently, with all the developments, we've seen, the U.S. Embassy come in and chime in on the issue and sort of condemn what's going on with the state of emergency. The Ethiopian government, still seems to have a lot of, its former allies and backers. So, what would you say to governments in the West who are still backing the current regime and see them still as a viable ally in the region.
I think the recent announcement, press statement by U.S. Embassy is encouraging. It's a little late, but better late than never. The UK, the European Union have followed in, but with a weaker statement. I think the US made a very right decision by disagreeing strongly with the state of emergency. Not only that, the ambassador has written a few days earlier strong statement condemning the killing. I think this was very important. I think the West, for a long time, knew the problem, knew the looming danger, but because they see the government as a key ally in the region, and because they felt that if they push the regime will turn into China or so on and so on, they were turning blind eye to problems. But the problem has reached, the political crisis is so acute today that they can no longer ignore it. The West has a very single interest in Ethiopia. It is security. It's not economy. It's nothing else. They have a security interest because the region is troubled. There is a lot of conflict in neighboring countries. Ethiopia is one that has some sense of stability, and of course, with some large population and the military, the West sees it as an ally, which is true, which is correct assessment. However, an Ethiopia that excludes 95% of the population, an Ethiopia where land and other resources are robbed of people, an Ethiopia that is source of the vast majority of refugees from in Africa, an Ethiopia where the best and brightest are either kicked out of the country or incarcerated, would not have a lasting stability. I have been saying this for the last 10, 12 years since I came to America. Every time I meet people, every time I have an opportunity, I have been saying this. And I think what is unfolding is really what a lot of people predicted. That is, it is a matter of time that the kind of sense of stability Mallas was projecting. So, the growth and the Ethiopia rising narrative Mallas and his Western supporters like Bill Gates were talking about was a sham. There was a volcano underneath that kind of image, and that volcano has started erupting in 2014. It continued to erupt and continued to grow, and I think the West finally start to wake up. The statement is good, but it's not sufficient. I think the West need to exert sufficient pressure on the government, but the government is extremely vulnerable now. Why? Because the cornerstone of the central piece of the strategy the Oromo protest and the Gero movement had deployed was to cripple the economy of the regime. The regime had multiple pillars of power. A lot of people thought, the military and the military and the security is the strongest, perhaps, but that wasn't the most important to the regime. The regime wanted to portray itself as a developmental state. Much of the bureaucracy, much of the party membership are not loyal to the party. They are only loyal to the money, the salary the government pays. So the strategy was simple. One is by focusing on trade routes and by focusing on targeting the economy. The strategy was one to reduce revenue for the regime, reduce revenue by cutting off trade the trade volume, by also driving away investment. So you cut the revenue at the same time by forcing the regime to deploy large army of soldiers and bureaucrats, and also pay for the lobbyists and so on, increase their expenditure. So on one hand, you increase you decrease their revenue. On the other hand, you increase their expenditure, and that had crippled the economy, and the government can no longer service the foreign debt. So the government needs the Western governments pumping money into it. Last year they did pump during Obama, but now I think they're tired of pumping money into it, and all they have to do is hold off a little bit from pumping money into the regime, and the regime will come and crawling, begging for the West or begging for the people to save it. And I think the West has a lot of leverage right now. I know the Germans and the British and mostly the Americans are trying, but that's not enough. We have probably few months to ensure peaceful transition in Ethiopia. Very, 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 very short period of time. Things can change very fast, as the ambassador said. Things change really, really fast in Ethiopia these days. And the only reason the regime remains intact today is because the Keros wanted it. The Keros are social movement. They are not political party. They don't want to take political power, so they don't want to create power vacuum at this moment. They want to create a political condition whereby a strong political party and another ruling party can compete, negotiate, and compromise, and create a political space where people can exercise their freedom. If the Keros want to get rid of this regime, they can do it in a matter of weeks. They have demonstrated that. But if the regime continues to kill and insists on this state of emergency, any further mass killing will not will not enable the Cairo leadership to restrain the young people from marching over to the palace and getting rid of the government from local to the federal level. So time is running, and time is of essence. And I think that not only the foreign governments, but also the elites, particularly the Tigrayan elites, need to exert utmost pressure on the government to come to the table.
Okay. So we've spoken about, the foreign factor and foreign governments and how they look at the situation. But how about within the country? The Cairo movement is mostly based in the Oromia region. The government narrative is that, they're causing instability and harming, people outside of the Oromo community. And so, I mean, what is the goal of the Cairo movement, and, what is your response to that allegation?
The allegation is bogus, and the regime has been doing this allegation for a long time. Before Cairo, every Oromo that shows any negative view toward the government were accused of being on ILF and thrown to jail. Since Cairo has emerged as a formidable force, an attempt to label and brand Cairo as troublemakers have been in full swing, but it did not work. Because whatever propaganda they come on the media, the Cairo can falsify it in the streets. The Cairo have been the most disciplined, the most peaceful, and powerful and effective social movement I have seen in the world. I study social movement, and I think if he's alive, Jean Sharp would agree with me. This is a fascinating non-violent movement. If you have seen just last week, they launched a 3-day strike. They achieved their tactical objective on the second day. On third day, they were cleaning the streets, because during the strikes they were putting roadblocks and so on and so on. So the streets were a little messy. So on the third day, they were cleaning streets. Do these young people sound like troublemakers? Do they look like hooligans? No. The government has attempted to use agents, infiltrators, to attack different communities, to defame the Keros. But the Keros have been arresting and detaining a number of agents and passing it to Oromia police. So that's why the government have not been able to instigate communal violence. The Ethiopian state from past to today has harvested Oromophobia as their tool again to keep Oromo voices silenced. And this regime has done quite successfully for a long time, but in the last 3-4 years, that attempt has failed. The communities in Oromia feel quite secure. That's why they are with people. They are with the Oromos, and the Oromos have demonstrated that not only in promises but also in actions. Today in Oromia, practically there is no government. I mean, there is no effective control over towns and villages. These have become self-administering villages. The Keros, in collaboration with local police, they ensure delivery of service and security. There is no town, as you know, Jilcha, there is no town where there is no other ethnic group in Oromia. Oromia is a multi-ethnic state. And, there are some here and there that the government have been able to investigate, but in Oromia, you don't see that kind of communal tension. You don't see communal problem, despite aggressively felt by the intelligence services. So the Cairo, their work speaks for them. I don't even have to explain. Their work speaks for them. That's why the 24-hour propaganda by the government did not work in scaring away even the Tigrayans. As we know today, it is the Tigrayan elites who control the state power, and it's them who commanded the military and the intelligence to kill our people. Even against them, there has not been attack. There are areas where Tigray intelligence officers and spies have been targeted. So are Oromo intelligence officers and Oromo police officers who kill people. But that is because of their action, not because of their ethnicity. That continues. But the civilians, whether they're Tigrayans, Gurage, Amhara, or Chinese, they are at peace in Oromia. There was a Dutchman last year. He had a flower farm in partnership with one of the TPLF people. The local farmers know because it's built in their land. They already knew. They went there, and they told the guy, "Is this your car? Take your car. We don't. We have no business in attacking you. We no one harm you. It is your car. Here's your road. Go." And they burn his farm. So it's a strategically guided non-violent movement. That's why the government continue to lose, and I think it will continue to lose in the future as well.
Okay. Very quickly, we mentioned at the beginning of the program displaced people from the areas of conflict on the Oromo and the Somali border region. What is the situation there now? Is there still raids going on with the federal army and the Leo police into the Oromia region, or has that situation subsided?
The situation in the border area remains intense, but daily clashes have been reduced to minimal. Remember, the Somali and Oromo as a people are not fighting. In fact, the two states are not fighting. It's not. It's a misinformation that has been spread around. This is a proxy war by the TPLF military and intelligence against Opidio. Because Opidio under Lerman Agarsa leadership has emerged as an assertive force and has attempted to disrupt some of the illegal trades of cat and the different contraband in the area. And the generals, particularly those who command the southeast branch of the military, are heavily involved in this. So they had a personal interest and they want to remain that. But that's not the only that's the personal level motive. But there is a grander political motive behind this. As the two senior leaders of TPLF, Abai Sahai and Siu Muslim, clearly stated, they feel that the Amhara and the Oromo are joining forces against the Tigrayans, and to save themselves, the Tigrayans want to create this, they have developed this crazy idea of minority alliance, and they are trying to bring the Somalis into their side, to corner the Oromos in the center. So since they know the Somalis and the Oromos are natural allies. I mean, where me and you will grow up, you cannot distinguish Somali from Oromo. And there's really no border between Somali and Oromo. There is no, let alone the physical boundaries. There is no cultural difference in that area. The Oromos and Somalis don't have. We cannot create enmity between them easily, no matter who you have as a regional president. So they wanted to instigate a bloody conflict so that a wound will be created between the Oromos and Somalis. And to implement that strategy, they found a crazy guy who had no consciousness. He had no political consciousness. He's utterly an uneducated guy. This Abdile. They used him, and they used this Liu police that committed genocide against Somalis in the past years. They instigated cross-border raid against Oromia, and they displaced over 1 million people. They killed thousands of people inside Somali region on the border. They were not able to infiltrate deep inside Oromia because the pastoralists defended themselves. So today there are two types of IDPs, or internally displaced Oromos in Ethiopia. There are about 120,000 people who were removed from their homes in Somali region. Somali region is home for the largest Oromo outside Oromia regional state. So they did remove about 120,000 people, and also this conflict happened over a long stretch of land from Moyale all the way to Bordade, covering about 5 provinces and tens of districts. So wherever this conflict was happening, this war was happening, people were forced to withdraw from their farms, from their homes, and retreat to other villages and districts. So that is about 900,000 people. So these all people today are in shelters. So they don't have homes. Their future is bleak because they can't go. There is no enough security to go back to the border, and there is no enough security for those who came from Somali region to return. because Abdi is the guy who implemented the TPLF strategy is still there. The Liu police is more powerful today because they are armed and trained even more. The military generals of the Tigrayans who commanded this war against Oromos remain in power. In fact, they have been rewarded for their action by adding more stars on their shoulders. So the situation remains murky. The future looks bleak for these people. But the good thing is the Oromos have come together in a unified manner to help these people. Despite the magnitude of the problem, they have been able to minimize loss of life. They have been able to prevent widespread outbreak of disease. They were able to prevent starvation, but we know that some 80,000 homes are built in central Oromia to resettle these people, but they have not resettled them yet, and even if they resettle them, what kind of job they're going to have in the future is still a question. A lot of complicated problem, Jilcha, on this matter.
And we've neared the end of the program, so if you have any closing statements, what would you say to the Ethiopian people, and what would you also say to the government itself?
I think my message to the Ethiopian people is they have fought in different forms and rallying around different demands for the last 50 years to establish a democratic order. I think the Ethiopian people from all walks of life, basically they want the same thing. They want freedom. They want respect for who they are and where they live. And they want to cultivate their natural resources and talents to escape poverty. Oromia and Ethiopia, they are not poor. They are impoverished because of continued exploitation by the elites and also by implementation of a policy that is not focused on empowering people. So they want basically three things. They want peace, they want democracy, and they want development. Getting these three together, they are inseparable. You cannot have one without another. Getting these three requires getting the politics right. Getting the politics right. I think we are getting almost there now. For first time, government in Ethiopia is about to fall due to popular, strategically guided civic resistance. I think people should be very, very careful in how we go from now onward. We have to be very calculative. We have to remain vigilant. We must not rush just to get rid of the government. We must plan very carefully how to bring it down and how to replace it. So people at this point particularly need to have patience. They don't want to ignore things. They don't want to be pessimistic, but they have to sustain pressure on the regime, but patiently, carefully, and strategically. And more importantly, this regime and regimes like this, when they are about to fall, they want to bring down the whole country with them to escape responsibility. And I can see that. What al-Bashir did, what Bashar al-Assad did in Syria. There is no guarantee that TPLF wouldn't do it in Ethiopia. We have to deny them that opportunity by minimizing violence, by working very, very hard on communal harmony, particularly in cities and borders that host diverse group of people. Cities like Dredawa, cities like Finfinne, cities like Shashamande in Jimma. These are very important cities. Cities like Dase. The regime and its agents would like to see bloody communal violence in this area. They must be denied that opportunity because that will not only prolong their life, it also helps them escape responsibility and take down the government with them. So the people must work together. The young people, young women, men, they have to be at the forefront of this. They have to remain vigilant and alert. For the government, I think if I'm in EPRDF or TPLF in whatever of one of those organizations, the first thing I need to do is sit alone and think and see that this is the end. It is over. We are in post-TPLF, post-EPRDF regime. The role of the current ruling party now is just about facilitating transition to a peaceful democratic order. If they are willing to submit to the will of the people, if they are willing to transition to democracy, they will make history. They might even get an opportunity for immunity to rewrite history, even probably as a party or as individuals to have a future in the politics of the country. People like Lamma, if they play right and if they make the finishing right, they could run in Oromia and regain the seat, So right now, on one side, you have this bright opportunity for the ruling elite. On the other side, if they choose path of violence, if they even think of maintaining authoritarian rule over Ethiopia after this, I guarantee them they are going to go down. This regime is collapsing. It's a matter of time. When they collapse, they will fall with it, and they will be destroyed, and there will be serious ramification going forward, particularly for TPLF. They always claim they fought with the people of Tigray. I know the Tigrayan people in general really didn't benefit. They just became scapegoats, and they are blamed for what the TPLF does. I think the TPLF, at least those reasonable, if there are reasonable men and women in the TPLF, they should be worried. They have an opportunity to safeguard the interest of the Tigrayan people in the democratic and system. But that's now. It is now, while they're still in control, while they still have opportunity, they should negotiate the best outcome for their people and for themselves. Because if they choose the path of violence, they will go down burning, and they will bring down their nation together. And I think they should avoid that. I think they should learn from history. I think they should look around the world and how this kind of system finally ends up. I think they should choose the path of peace and the path of transition to democracy. I do plead with them to it is better late than never. I think they should discuss among themselves, and I think they should come to the table to engage in negotiated transition to democracy.
Perfect. And that actually concludes our program today. I would like to thank the director of OMN, Jawar Mohammed, for joining us. And I'd also like to thank our viewers for tuning in. And hopefully you'll tune in next time. Goodbye.